Hi, this is group number 3. We're presenting the United States versus Darby Lumber. Group members are Benjamin Chan, Nick Heward, Shane Nishikawa, and Brian Whittaker. So we're going to go ahead and get started about the facts, details, and history of the case. Darby Lumber was the appealee. This case was argued in 1940. December 20th or 19th and 20th. They disagreed with an indictment found in the district court for Southern Georgia, charging them with violations of some subsections of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. And these sections that they had violated included, in the act, it was about regulation of the minimum wage and the number of hours that they needed to that the employees needed to reach before getting paid overtime, which was 40 hours. The minimum wage was 25 cents an hour at the time. The company also needed to maintain those records of the payment of the employees and also provide them to the government. Darby argued that the government had actually overstepped their bounds of regulation of commerce. They argued that manufacturing is not interstate commerce, and they brought forth a court case called, of the title Hammer and Dagenhart in 1918 that decided that Congress did not have the power to regulate the interstate commerce of goods that were produced by children, and thus at the time child labor was actually allowed. They felt that with similar cases that the interstate commerce that was regulated by Congress was noxious articles, stolen articles, kidnapped persons, and other articles such as intoxicating liquor or goods made by convicts. And none of what they had produced in the lumber industry fell into any of those categories. And so they felt that they had actually overstepped their bounds. And the argument that the U.S. made was businesses produce their goods without any regard to where they're going to be shipped. You know, a product made by Darby may be picked up in Georgia and shipped immediately to Louisiana without any thought, without second thought of, hey, you know, they need to pay overtime or we need to have minimum wage back applied to these employees. And they also thought that proper record keeping was appropriate for a business to engage in. So now we're going to go to the opinions. First, we're going to start with the lower courts. The District Court for the United States of Southern District of Georgia, they agreed with Darby Lumber and they stopped the charge. So the U.S. Appealed, and the decision was made in 1941, early in February 3rd, and Mr. Justice Stone delivered the opinion. It was a unanimous decision to reverse the decision of the appellate court. And their reasoning behind it, to counter what Darby had said, the purpose of the Fair Labor Standards Act was to actually prevent states from using different labor laws to their own economic advantage by interstate commerce, such as Georgia. At the time, they didn't have very much regulation on their commerce. So they may have had very low or no minimum wage, which would compete heavily with, let's say, in Louisiana, if they had a minimum wage of 30 cents, there's this huge competitive advantage. And so they wanted to regulate that to have more of a level playing field. The opinion also cited 2 acts that had been defended in court cases previously, and they thought that this applied and said that Congress had not overstepped their bounds in this regulation of commerce. These 2 acts were the Sherman Act, which regulated or which outlawed monopolies, and the National Labor Relations Act, which protected the rights of employees and employers and encouraged collective bargaining, amongst other items. And a quote from the opinion stated, "The requirement for records, even of the intrastate transaction, is an appropriate means to the legitimate end in regards to maintaining records for employees." The employers need to be able to keep track of how much their employees are getting paid, and they need to provide them. It just makes sense to do that.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the development and ramification of the Darby, the US v. Darby lumber decision. So first of all, the historical context. This court case came about a very interesting, fascinating time in American history. It occurred right during the Great Depression. So it was very fortuitous in many ways that the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the United States, because there was this danger that there'd be a race downward, a spiral downward, meaning that, as Nick mentioned, Louisiana or Georgia or any other neighboring state could start cutting wages lower and lower and lower. And that would start impacting the quality of life of the workers. They could force overtime and things like that. So the Supreme Court, the federal government, upheld minimum standards for workers. It also laid the groundwork for the United States to become an economic giant post-World War II by getting our house in order, as it were, by clearly defining the rules of interstate commerce. This provided the guidelines, the framework for after World War II for our economy just to take off spectacularly. As mentioned, since the Supreme Court said it is a normal in course of business to keep professional records, professional record keeping really took off from this moment forward. And this impacted finances, paying taxes, how to dole out payroll, things like that. And thus, it had a more direct effect of overturning Hammer v. Dagenhart. Thus, child labor was forbidden. The only exception was agriculture, and that exists to this day when children can still work in agricultural in the fields. But as far as working in factories and like lumber yards, they were forbidden. So the political context, what did this court case mean? So again, we would argue, our group, that this lays the groundwork for supremacy of federal laws over state or local laws in the area of commerce. The Dagenhart decision was sort of an anomaly insofar it gave a lot of power to the states, but this is the federal government reasserting control. And this segues into the supremacy of federal law in regards to other events that start happening in the 1950s and 60s, including civil rights. So again, the Supreme Court, the federal government are asserting their authority. This emboldens the power of unions. The Supreme Court ruled on the side of worker rights. And again, this would lay the groundwork for the rise of unions in the 1950s and 60s, which coincided with a huge economic boom. And overall, the overall gestalt of what is happening is the federal government has a vested interest in the public health and welfare of its citizens. They will intervene to protect the citizen. This goes beyond child labor. This goes beyond how many hours people work or what wages they get. They're concerned with the overall welfare of the citizens. I want to make sure we're not racing downward, spiraling downward. So lastly, we would argue the final ramification is the United States government has power to enforce laws on interstate commerce, including setting minimum wage and maximum hours worked per week and work records. And I love this picture. This is actually a national marker found in Darby Lumber Company, and it talks about how this case, as we spoke about, laid the groundwork for all these different issues. So if any of you live in Georgia or are visiting Georgia, you can go by and check this out. So again, in summary, United States versus Darby Lumber, it reasserted federal supremacy over interstate commerce, which laid the groundwork for a lot of different movements that started happening in the 1950s and 60s. All right, thank you.